This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network. The music on this podcast is brought to you by Michael Drake. To find out more about Michael Drake, visit semanticdrumming.com. You can also find Michael Drake's music on YouTube, Tumblr, Spotify, and iTunes.
Yep, his uncle was saying, sucking on a long stem pipe. I've crossed the Ohio River twice since I was here last. It's a great river, an even greater country beyond, the middle ground. It's a country where only the brave or foolish enter. The foolish don't come back, and pretty regular the brave don't either. Few of us that have ever been there and back ever go across again. Mark, my boy, Tom's voice was growing more animated now. You couldn't believe what these old eyes have seen. Land so fertile a bean grows like a tree, and the grass tickles your belly when you walk. And game? Buffalo so many they shake the ground enough to jar your teeth. Deer, too, by the thousands. And elk? You ever seen an elk? Big deer they are, big enough that one of them would feed your house for a month or more. Mark, there's birds so plentiful they make night out of day when they pass over. Takes hours, sometimes days, for them to fly by, and so thick a single brawl brings down 2, 3, maybe 5 birds. And that's not all. They's wolves and coons and beavers, mink, otters, and you name it. There's bears by the thousands and painters behind every rock, wildcats as big as hounds, squirrels thick as lice on a hen. Turkeys all over, and fish. I never seen such waters for fish, nose to tail, in every creek. But it's a red land, boy, a bad land. It's a land to die in afore it's time to die. Belongs to them what claims it, and that means the Indians. They's all kinds there, and you just go to where you think you understand one, when sudden like he's gone and another takes his place. That's all different. They's Iroquois, Mohawk, Senecas, Shawnees, Miamis, Delawares, Wyandottes, Potawatomis, and a dozen or more others I'd rather forget. That's why they call it the middle ground. It's smack in the middle where they all come together and no one owns, but everyone claims. So streams is oftener than not red with blood from them what lost their cabin sudden. Them Indians will kill other Indians just as quick as they'll kill whites, and they don't do it pretty. This was a excerpt from The Frontiersman by Alan W. Eckert. These were words that were spoken by Thomas Kenton, which was the great uncle of Simon Kenton, the famous pioneer in Kentucky.
That gives us a great picture of what the first explorers were seeing when they arrived here in Kentucky. I would like to welcome everybody back to our podcast on the history of Kentucky. For this episode, we're going to be talking about the native tribes of Kentucky.
At this part, there are really many archaeologists say were not very many Indian tribes living in Kentucky at the time of the white man that came here, but there were basically 4 principal tribes that were found in this wilderness paradise that we just described. The first and foremost, most people would say, were the Shawnee Indians. They lived north of Kentucky, maybe in northern Kentucky, along the Ohio River and in Ohio. They were the closest tribe, and they fought hard to keep the white men from taking over Kentucky. And they were the tribe that early settlers feared the most. The Shawnee Indians were basically claiming Kentucky just like the Cherokee were, the Choctaw, the Cherokees, and the Chickasaws. The Iroquois, the powerful Iroquois, claimed Kentucky as well, even though they lived in what is now upstate New York. They were part of the Five Nations, the Iroquois tribe, and they didn't really see eye to eye with the Shawnee, and the Shawnee didn't accept the Iroquois' claim of Kentucky. Thus, there was a lot of friction and fighting over it. But you can see why these tribes, why did they come into Kentucky? Well, it was the happy hunting ground. It was the game that was here. Resources, why did the early settlers come to North America? Why did the early North American settlers cross over the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky? Because of resources, because things that people needed to survive. And this leads us along a trail to look back at Native Americans and how they used resources, and we talked in our last time about the Paleo Indians and the early Archaic and then the beginning of agriculture. And for a lot of people, agriculture is just something that appeared, but it's not quite so the way that it was. Agriculture started in North America, in Mesoamerica, which is Central America, Mexico, Costa Rica, that region. And there was a monocotyledoned grass that had a stem on it about the size of your little finger. It had kernels that were hard-shelled. And these hard-shelled, one of the greatest technological advances in North America, we talk about fire, but it was agriculture. That really stemmed the tide and changed, the different cultures after the Ice Age. And finding this grass that later became corn, there were, over a process of hundreds of years, these kernels on this grass that didn't have a hard shell were picked and planted and tried to grow a type of grass or corn that yielded a soft kernel of corn without a hard shell on it, which they did. And that was in Central America. So it wasn't, I've always thought that, when the Pilgrims came, they told, the Indians told the Pilgrims how to plant corn in a hole and all this stuff with a fish. That's all true. But the corn was not here. It was in Central America. And it shows you the trading system because corn was traded. When we talk about agriculture, probably the first crop that Native Americans grew in agriculture was not corn. It was yellow squash. And that was probably something that grew wild in the Midwest of North America. Corn came from Central America, was traded, was developed over thousands of years, the same way with beans. Native Americans, when they, and I like this word, gardened, they call it gardening, archaeologists do. They grew the corn, they grew the beans, which also came from Mesoamerica, from Central America, from these highly civilized civilizations there that traded all the way and, round up in Kentucky and Ohio and so forth. Corn, beans, and gourds were grown as well, very important for storage of liquids and so forth. Sunflowers and tobacco were also traded. Salt was also very important, and it was traded in Kentucky. So, we have this idea of resources. And when we talked about last time when we were talking about the Adena people, for instance, and you made the comment, well, they were hunters and gatherers. Yeah. And I said, yes. Mm-hmm. And that's partly true. People were not just farmers. They hunted and gathered too. And I want to say something more about agriculture. I want to talk about women. Who did the farming in Native Americans? It was women. It wasn't the men. The men went off on long hunts and who knows what they did. The women, which had children and had to be in one place and take care of them, they stayed home and they worked the fields, the women and children, while the men went off hunting and playing or whatever they do. Went on long hunts and so forth. So women are really the agriculturalists in the village.
I got a question here, Mr. Pope. You were talking a little bit ago about the Shawnee living in Ohio or maybe even northern Kentucky. And I just want to remind people, too, that back when Native Americans were roaming Kentucky and the surrounding areas, there weren't political lines drawn of this state is here, this state there, this is the Shawnee, this is the Iroquois. Those lines didn't exist.
That's right. That's exactly right. There's no lines. There's geographic areas, and all these tribes were part of what we call the Woodland Cultures. They made their houses out of wood, woven sticks and huts, longhouses, like the Iroquois and the Shawnee did. Their villages sometimes were walled, fortified areas, which leads us to believe that there were possibly raids from other tribes, specifically on their locations. But for the Shawnee Indians, Kentucky was a wonderful place, a hunting ground. It had broad valleys, lush meadows and forested hills. They were an ideal home, and for hunting territory. And let me say, a point I wanted to make about agriculture and about these different tribes, such as the Shawnee, which were farmers, they were agriculture. But they depended on agriculture, and it allowed them to stay in one place, unlike the paleo that moved around. But even the agriculture communities moved around. They were totally in tune with nature. And if crops failed, or if they ran out of hunting animals, if they became scarce, they didn't just stay in one place. To stay in one place was to die.
Yeah.
They moved. They moved whole villages to other areas. And when you talk about eastern Kentuckies and you talk about, the mountains and the forests and so forth, in my mind, there were smaller villages of people, and they moved around even more. And they were less, agriculture dependent. They were more dependent on deer and hunting. One thing about these 4 different nations that we talked about, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, and the Iroquois, is that when they planned hunting trips, they didn't just go randomly. Deer was their main animal to hunt. And many of them went to white oak forests in the fall of the year when the acorns, the mast they called it, would fall on the ground, and the deer would come to specific places to eat that mast.
Yeah.
And that's where they would hunt and find the deer. They also had villages that they and campsites were near salt licks because they knew that the animals would be drawn to those salt licks, and so that's where they located. They located their villages. They located their hunts where the animals were.
So it wasn't just hey son, let's grab your bow, let's go get us a dinner. These were month excursions or month trips.
Absolutely.
Even
and you've got these 4 tribes that sometimes would come, at the same time to the same areas. And that's when there'd be problems. That's when the water would run red with blood. Let's just talk about geographic locations since you brought it up. We're talking about the Shawnee basically being north of the Ohio River.
Yes.
Okay. Places like Chillicothe, which were large agriculture villages. The Shawnee nations, to a certain extent, I read somewhere where many of the different villages specialized in certain things among the Shawnee.
Yeah.
Some were warriors.
Gotcha.
Some were farmers. And they defended even though they were all connected.
Yeah.
The Cherokee were in Appalachia. They were in what's Tennessee, North Carolina, northern Georgia, the southern Appalachia. The Chickasaw were in western Kentucky and western Tennessee.
Yeah.
And, of course, the Iroquois were in what is now the state of New York.
Yes.
And they ruled a large area and were very powerful and warlike.
And which they were the 5 nations.
That's right.
So that's right. Which is another thing we can get into a little bit later about governing and such. So pretty much you have 3 main tribes that surround Kentucky.
That's right.
And then with the Iroquois up in the north or in New York.
A Shawnee town might have 40 to 100 bark-covered houses, similar in construction to the Iroquois, longhouses.
Yeah.
And the Iroquois and the Cherokee were matrilineal. That means that when you married, you moved into the female's family side longhouse. You became part of their family. And there were maybe 5 to 10 families in one longhouse that kept a fire going.
And you're saying, the male, like if a male married, they went into the female's family.
That's correct.
Okay.
And also, it's even interesting with the Cherokee, when they had the matrilineal lines, for children, they were, their role models were the uncles of the mother. Not the father.
Which is
so the family was constructed that the uncles, the family members would pretty much raise the children. more so than the father.
Wow,
that's pretty interesting. Remember, we're talking about tribal.
Yeah, and you bring that up, but if you think about it, and this just popped in my head. So if you have a tribe or a family that has brothers and sisters, plenty, I would assume, quite large families. And you have somebody marries into that family, a male comes into that family, and his children are raised by the uncles, but yet when those uncles and those aunts have children, he's responsible for raising those children. So wouldn't it be creating a huger bond of family and structure where everybody is involved?
That's right. It says it takes a village to raise a child, and that's true in tribal communities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole idea of tribal is that everyone owns the children.
Yeah.
And everybody raises them together. And, we look at Africa today, and, in West Africa, it's the same way. Children are susceptible to punishment from anybody in society, in public. It's not like, well, you parents take care of your kids. If there's a child that's stepping out of line, it's everybody's responsibility to correct them, and nobody gets their feelings hurt. It's a tribal idea. And also with food, we talk about food. If you go on a hunt and you're lucky and your clan kills some deer and nobody else has any, you share with everyone.
Yeah.
Everything's divided equally. As far as agricultural things as well, everybody shares equally in the distribution of food. But the Shawnee were similar to the Iroquois in their longhouses. They were driven from Kentucky, the Shawnee were, by the Iroquois in the 1670s. And that was part of the fur wars, where they began to depend on fur and trading. They fought a desperate fight for Kentucky with the Iroquois, Cherokee, and even the Western pioneers as they expanded into Kentucky.
Now, would you say that the Iroquois, being the Five Nations, would they be larger than the Shawnee?
I think
more
they
powerful,
were.
I
Yes,
guess.
they were. They were the most feared and revered, and they claimed this area.
Yeah.
But the Shawnee did not give up their claim of Kentucky. They bitterly fought for it. I want to say something again, going back about burial, because I read where we talk about them being north of the Ohio River. In northern Kentucky, they found Shawnee burial grounds that were interesting. They were usually a round hole, and the bodies were put in a fetal position when they were buried, and they were buried with their atlatls, their projectile points, their gorgets, and also their dogs. And so in the Native American burial ground, you'll either find a dog on top of the human that's buried, or you'll find a graveyard right next to the Native, where they buried dogs. Dogs were very important to the Shawnee.
Wow.
And they had burial sites for their dogs because they were so important for hunting, and they also developed a relationship, just like people today with their dogs. And they were buried with their dogs. So dog bones and human bones would all be together in this round, circular grave.
Right. Wow. With that being said, do you know what kind of dogs they liked? I mean, as far as hunting goes, is that what we're
Well, I
thinking?
doubt if it was Chihuahua. But I would imagine that we're talking now about the origin of dogs, just like we are in agriculture. And, their ancestors were the wolves.
Yes.
So you can imagine they took puppies from wolves and domesticated them. That's where dogs came from.
Wow.
All dogs.
Wow.
So that's the origin of them. So you got an idea what they look like.
You think of your kid wanting a puppy, and you go out and get a wolf cub.
That's right.
That is extreme, or that sounds extreme to us.
Yeah.
Well, going back, Mr. Pope, you brought up the Shawnee and how they were specific on having roles of farmers, roles of warriors, and I found that their chiefs, they had a village chief that was, I guess in charge of the whole clan, or the whole, well, not the clan. They were in charge of the village.
Actually, sometimes they had more than one chief.
More than one chief. Yeah. Oh, well, that's what I was saying. I found where they actually had like war chiefs. You had a war chief that was just in charge of the warriors, and obviously going to war, battle plans, that kind of stuff. But then you had the main chief. So their system of government was pretty complex, really.
It really was. It really was.
This concludes part 1 of our discussion on Native Americans. Stay posted for part 2. Thank you for listening. If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you are enjoying the content of this podcast and would like to support it, visit anchor.fm/The Meadows Kentucky History /support. You can also find this link in the show's description. If you want to help our podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks for all your support.